Australia has a way of making you feel small, not just physically, not just because of the distances or the emptiness of the desert, but in a deeper, quieter way, a way that creeps in when the road disappears behind you and the silence gets too complete. Most countries have a handful of places with a dark reputation. Australia has entire regions where the locals will not go after dark, where tourist bodies have been found without explanation, where sounds come from directions that make no geographic sense. Today, we are going inside 10 of the most genuinely unsettling places on the continent. Not haunted houses with gift shops, the real ones. The ones where rangers file incident reports they cannot explain and then quietly ask for a transfer. If you are finding this useful, hit subscribe and turn on the bell. I cover Australian history and places every week, and what comes next is going to stay with you. Number 10. The Aradale Lunatic Asylum, Ararat, Victoria. There is a building in the Victorian goldfields town of Ararat that has been called the largest mental institution in the Southern Hemisphere. Aradale opened in 1867 and did not close until 1998. In between those two dates, approximately 13,000 people died inside its walls. That number is not a guess. It is on the official institutional record, and it is the first thing that makes Aradale different from other abandoned hospitals in Australia. You can put a number to the suffering here. The sprawling red brick complex sits on a slight rise above the town, visible from the highway, looking from a distance like something between a university and a prison. The original design projected calm authority, the Victorian idea that an imposing building would impose order on disturbed minds. What it actually created was a sealed world with its own internal logic, its own rules, its own cemetery on the grounds, and its own buried history. Staff members who worked the night shifts in the final years described an atmosphere in the older wards that most found genuinely difficult to articulate. Not frightening exactly, more like a pressure behind the eyes and a persistent feeling that something was standing just outside the frame of what you could see. Long-term psychiatric patients who had lived in the building for decades referred to specific rooms as cold rooms, meaning rooms they refused to enter regardless of instruction or consequence. These were not patients in acute psychotic episodes. These were long-term residents who had mapped the building over years in a way that the staff eventually found instructive. The cold rooms were concentrated in the older sections of the male wing, built in the 1870s and never substantially renovated. The acoustic properties of the original underground water infrastructure create noise transference between parts of the building that should have no acoustic connection. Sound from one end of a sealed corridor travels to another sealed corridor with no structural connection between them. Engineers who assessed the building after closure documented this and could not fully explain it. Aradale now operates as a heritage site with occasional public access. The guides who run night tours report an unusually high rate of visitors who ask to leave before the tour concludes. The average departure point is the same corridor, every time. Number 9. Lake Disappointment, Western Australia. The name was given in 1897 by explorer Frank Henn, who followed creek systems for weeks across the Gibson Desert, expecting them to lead to a large freshwater lake. What he found instead was a salt lake, flat and white and absolutely dead, with no water he could use, and no exit route that made geographic sense given the direction of the draining creeks. He named it Disappointment and left as quickly as he could. The name stuck because it turned out to be accurate in ways that went beyond Hann's particular frustration. Lake Disappointment sits inside an area that the Matu people, the traditional custodians of this country, have long identified as restricted ground. The specific reason for that restriction is not discussed publicly by Matu elders. What is known is that the lake features in Matu law in a way that marks it as qualitatively different from other sacred sites in the region. The few non-Indigenous survey teams who have worked in the area over the decades have filed reports that, read together, build a strange pattern. Equipment malfunctions at rates that cannot be attributed to environmental factors alone. Compasses behave erratically, not just near the lake, but across a radius of several kilometers around it. This has a partial explanation in the rare earth mineral deposits beneath the surface, which include significant concentrations of potassium, sodium, and magnesium, enough to create measurable magnetic interference. But magnetic interference does not explain the consistent reports of disorientation that persists after leaving the area, or the recurring accounts of sounds with no environmental source. 3 separate survey teams between 1,970 and 1,995 included notes in their official reports about auditory experiences in the field that they described in clinical language, but that, stripped of that language, amount to hearing things that were not there. The lake is not publicly accessible. The road that nominally leads to it is not maintained. The Matu have never requested that it be open for tourism. That alone should tell you something. Number 8. Monte Cristo Homestead, Junee, New South Wales. The house was built in 1885 by Christopher William Crawley, who ran the property for 27 years before dying in 1910. His wife Elizabeth stayed after his death and did not leave for the next 23 years. She stepped outside twice, once to attend Mass, and once when the house was briefly on fire. Elizabeth died in 1933, and the house began its long slide into a different kind of reputation. Over the following decades, a caretaker was burned alive in the stables. A maid fell from a balcony. The circumstances contested in contemporary accounts. A pregnant woman died on the property. A child was kept chained in a small outbuilding for years. A man was found deceased on the grounds after wandering up the driveway in a confused state. None of these events is particularly mysterious in isolation. Rural properties in that era accumulated their share of tragedy, but Monte Cristo accumulated events with a consistency that attracted attention even at the time. Local newspapers from the 1940s and 1950s include references to the property remarkable in one specific way, which is that working journalists writing for a regional audience with no interest in the supernatural described the house as one that people in the district avoided without being able to fully explain why. It was not the history exactly, it was the feeling of the place. The current owners have lived on the property since 1963 and have documented their experiences in detail. What they describe is not dramatic. It is the persistent low-level wrongness of a house that does not feel empty when it should. Monte Cristo is open to visitors. Those who stay the night almost universally describe the same thing, the sense that the house is aware of them. Number 7. The Dog Fence, South Australia, Outback section. The Dog Fence is a real structure, stretching 5,614 kilometres across inland Australia to separate sheep country from dingo territories. It is the longest fence in the world. Most of it is unspectacular. Rusted wire and wooden posts across flat scrub, maintained by boundary riders whose job is one of the loneliest in the country. But there is a section in the far north of South Australia running through country so remote that the nearest town is more than 3 hours of dirt road away that has generated a consistent body of accounts from boundary riders over several decades. Not ghost stories exactly. Something different. Riders working this section alone report a phenomenon that the official community of boundary riders discusses with a matter-of-factness that is itself unsettling, because it suggests familiarity with something that should not be familiar. They call it the second vehicle. On a completely flat plain, in zero visual obstruction, riders regularly hear and sometimes briefly see what appears to be another vehicle travelling parallel to them at a distance. Not approaching, not receding, keeping pace. When they stop, it stops. When they move, it moves. There is no road where the second vehicle appears to be. There is no track. The plain is flat enough that a vehicle on the surface would be visible for 20 kilometres in daylight. There is nothing there when they look. 3 boundary riders between 1988 and 2014 left this posting early, citing the experience as the reason. The Roads Department, which maintains the fence, does not comment on the accounts, but consistently struggles to fill this particular posting. Number 6. Port Arthur, Tasmania. Port Arthur is the most visited heritage site in Tasmania. It is also one of the most genuinely terrible places in the country's history. The convict settlement operated from 1833 to 1877 and processed more than 12,000 convicts through a system designed to break the human spirit through isolation, silence, and the removal of individual identity. The separate prison, completed in 1848, was considered by its designers a humanitarian advance on physical punishment. Prisoners were kept in individual cells. They wore hoods outside those cells so they could not make eye contact with other prisoners. They were referred to by numbers rather than names. They moved through the prison in total silence enforced by padded corridors and rubberized shoe covers. The architects believed they were saving souls by forcing inward reflection. What they actually produced was a cohort of men who, when released, could not function in social environments and often could not speak normally after years of enforced silence. Port Arthur is layered. The beautiful ruined stone buildings and the green lawns and the guided tours are the top layer. Underneath is the documented record of what actually happened here across 4 decades. Night tours generate a volume of paranormal incident reports that is statistically anomalous, even under the most skeptical interpretation. The site's own records include incident logs not available to the public, but described by former staff in interviews. What those logs consistently document is not dramatic apparitions, but micro-events. Cold areas in specific rooms that do not change seasonally, sounds in the separate prison with no acoustic source, and the particular quality of the model prison chapel, where silence was once enforced by penalty, a silence that several researchers have described as seeming to persist in the room, even when it is full of people. Number 5. Hanging Rock, Victoria. On Valentine's Day in 1900, 3 schoolgirls and one of their teachers climbed Hanging Rock in the Macedon Ranges, north of Melbourne, and did not come down. One girl was found days later with no memory of what had happened. The others were never found. The disappearances are historical fact. Joan Lindsay's 1967 novel and Peter Weir's 1975 film transformed them into a cultural artifact of Australian unease about the landscape, the feeling that the bush takes things and does not give them back. But Hanging Rock was unsettling before 1900 and remains unsettling in ways that have nothing to do with the missing girls. The formation is a volcanic extrusion about 6 million years old, a mammalian of rhyolite lava that pushed through surrounding sandstone and cooled in formations that create enclosures and passages at unpredictable angles. The magnetic properties of the basalt cause compass deviation, measurable enough to document, but irregular enough to be practically useless. Compasses give different readings 5 meters apart. The Judja Wurrung people, the traditional custodians, considered Hanging Rock a site of ceremony and power, not a place for casual visitation. The white settlement history of the area, from the 1840s onward, includes accounts of disorientation on the rock that predate the 1,900 disappearances by decades. People losing track of time. People losing direction on a formation small enough to see across. People hearing sounds with no source. The 1,900 disappearances fit a pattern that was already there. The rock did not start doing something new that day. It continued doing what it had always done. Number 4. Myall Creek, New South Wales. What happened at Myall Creek Station in June 1838 is documented in more detail than most events of its kind because it resulted in criminal trials. 28 Werrare people, the majority of them women, children, and elders who had gathered near the station in a non-threatening way, were killed by a group of stockmen over the course of an afternoon. The bodies were burned. 7 of the killers were eventually hanged, which was extraordinary at the time, a moment in which the legal system briefly functioned in a way it almost never did in relation to frontier violence. The site itself, the actual location near Myall Creek, carries something in its atmosphere that the memorial established there in 2000 does not dispel and perhaps intensifies. People who visit consistently describe it as one of the most affecting places they have been to in Australia, not in a spiritual tourism sense, but in the sense of a weight that attaches itself to you while you are there and is slow to lift when you leave. This is not the same as a ghost story, and it should not be categorized with one. It is something more like the phenomenology of witness, the way a landscape that absorbed something of that scale becomes different to walk through. Rangers who maintain the site have spoken in interviews about the particular quality of quiet at this location, a quiet that is not peaceful. There is a difference, they say, between stillness and silence. The area around Myall Creek has the second one. Number 3. The Kalgoorlie Super Pit area, Western Australia. The Super Pit is the largest open-cut gold mine in Australia. A hole in the ground nearly 4 kilometres long, 1.5 kilometres wide, and 600 metres deep. It is an obvious landmark, visible from space, but the land immediately surrounding the mine, in a radius extending about 15 kilometres from the pit edge, has generated a body of accounts from workers and nearby residents that does not fit neatly into either the industrial or the supernatural category. Long-haul truck drivers working night shifts on the roads, connecting the pit to processing facilities, describe a persistent phenomenon on one particular stretch, cutting through low mulga scrub about 8 kilometers from the main pit. Entrance. The stretch has no associated heritage site, no documented history of incident, nothing in the formal record to explain what drivers describe, which is a recurring visual impression, always at night, always in the same location, of movement at the roadside, in the scrub. Not animal movement. Something about the quality of the movement is described as wrong in a way that drivers find difficult to specify. Animals move with biological logic. They react to headlights. They have a recognizable physical relationship with the ground. What drivers on this stretch describe does not have that relationship. The mine company is aware of the accounts because some have been included in driver handover notes over the years. They attribute the phenomenon to fatigue and the extreme isolation of desert night work, which may be correct, but the location specificity, the same stretch of road, the same direction, the same quality of movement described across different workers over different years, suggests something more particular than general fatigue. Number 2. Hallett Cove, South Australia. Hallett Cove is a coastal conservation park about 25 kilometres south of Adelaide, known among geologists because it contains glacial formations from around 300 million years ago, scratched into the bedrock by ice sheets moving north across a landscape that was then inside the polar circle. The formations are scientifically significant and visually striking, but the section of the cove accessible only at low tide, running north from the main viewing platform under an overhang of exposed strata, is a different environment from the rest of the park. The Kaurna people, whose country this is, have specific accounts associated with this particular stretch of coastline that predate European settlement. What is publicly known is that the site is considered a threshold place in Kaurna cosmology, a category referring to locations where the ordinary and something else overlap in ways that require careful management. The physical environment of the low tide section reinforces this without endorsing its cosmological framing. The acoustics under the overhang are extremely unusual, gathering sound from the water in ways that produce auditory experiences inconsistent with the actual wave pattern. At certain tidal states, the sound profile in the enclosed section resembles human vocalization, closely enough that first-time visitors regularly look for its source. There is no source. It is the tide and the rock formation. But the experience of standing in a 300 million-year-old glacially scratched cave, listening to something that sounds like voices assembling themselves out of water, tends to end visits to this section of Hallett Cove fairly quickly. Number 1. The Nullarbor Plain, Eucla sector. The Nullarbor is 270,000 square kilometres of flat limestone plain across the border of South Australia and Western Australia. The name comes from the Latin for no trees, and it is accurate. Almost nothing grows there except low saltbush, and for hundreds of kilometres in the central section, there is nothing visible in any direction except the horizon repeating itself. It is one of the very few places on Earth where you can drive for hours without the landscape changing in any meaningful way. A perceptual experience that most people find disorienting in ways they could not predict before they experienced it. The Eucla sector, near the defunct telegraph station on the South Australian side, is the part of the Nullarbor that generates the specific body of accounts, distinguishing it from ordinary remoteness. The Mooning and Wirangu people, the traditional custodians of this section, have oral traditions describing the Nullarbor as a listening place, not restricted from visitation, but qualitatively different in the attention it pays to people moving across it. The cave systems beneath the plain are among the least explored large cave systems on Earth. They extend for kilometres beneath the limestone, accessible only through sinkholes called blowholes. Because of the breath of air, they exhale as pressure systems change. Cavers who have explored the accessible sections describe the deeper passages in terms that go beyond the usual vocabulary of cave environment. The silence in the deeper sections is, by their accounts, not simply the absence of sound, but something that feels more actively present than that. A silence that seems to have its own texture and temperature. Above the surface, on the plain itself, the specific accounts distinguishing Eucla from the rest of the Nullarbor involve a range of sightings documented by truck drivers, travellers, and the handful of people who have camped on the plain over several decades. What they see, consistently, at certain points on the plain in the early morning hours, is the figure of a person walking well off any road or track. When approached, the figure does not resolve into anything explainable. Several drivers have stopped and searched the area around where they saw the figure. The plain is flat enough that a person who had been there would still be visible for several kilometers in any direction. There is nothing there. The Nullarbor has no explanation for this, and neither does anyone else. What it does have is 30,000 years of human movement across its surface, the longest continuous record of human presence in any landscape on Earth. And whatever that accumulation means for what the plain has absorbed and what it still carries, the geology and the incident reports together cannot fully account for it. Every one of these places is still there. The asylum still sits above Ararat. The salt lake still reflects nothing back. The plain is still listening. Australia was occupied by human beings for 60,000 years before Europeans arrived, and the landscapes they managed, moved through, and understood in ways we are only beginning to recover the outline of, are still here too, still shaped by that long attention. The places on this list are not anomalies. They are concentrations of something the continent holds in significant supply. If this script made you think about any of these places differently, share it with someone who thinks they know Australia. And if you want the full deep dive on any one of these locations, tell me in the comments which one you want first. Every one of them has considerably more to it than what fits in a single list like this one. The channel goes where its audience wants to go. Subscribe now, so you can come along with us.